Good morning, and welcome to the latest installment of the Global Energy Institute's EnergyInnovates series. We have a great program today on grid resilience, which is well timed with the Department of Energy's launch of its Building a Better Grid initiative just last week. As our transition to a lower carbon electricity future progresses, the demand on today's electric grid to integrate an increasing group of electricity dependent users with a growing diversity of generation resources is at an all-time high. This rethinking of the grid requires an evolution of the technologies and design of the wires and associated infrastructure that are essential to supporting our economy and our way of life. The grid is changing to facilitate the energy transition, and as it does, the preservation of reliability and resilience is critical. Before we get started, we have a brief message from our sponsor, Siemens Energy, after which we will hear from Congressman Bob Latta of Ohio to kick off the program.
Congressman Bob Latta has represented Ohio's 5th Congressional District in the United States House of Representatives since 2007. Congressman Latta is a member of the House Energy and Commerce Committee, where he plays an intricate role in crafting the nation's energy, telecommunications, environment, healthcare, and interstate commerce policy. Latta is the Republican leader of the Subcommittee on Communications and Technology, where he advocates for policies that help consumers grow our economy and spur innovation. Latta co-chairs the Grid Innovation Caucus, which was founded to provide a forum for discussing solutions to the many challenges facing the grid. Welcome, Congressman Latta.
Well, thank you very much, Ruth. Great to be with you.
Yeah, thank you for being here. Let's jumping into it. Congressman, together with Jerry McNerney, you co-chair the House's Grid Innovation Caucus. As part of this partnership, you've introduced several bills aimed at bolstering the resiliency and security of the nation's electric grid. What motivated you to focus your time and effort on what is arguably a niche issue, fully appreciated by those in the industry, but perhaps underappreciated by about everyone else? And what do you hope to achieve by shining a bright spotlight on transmission grid and its critical role for our nation, both within Congress and beyond the Beltway?
Well, thanks very much. I really appreciate the chamber doing this, and because it's very, very important. Jerry McNerney and I both serve on the Energy and Commerce Committee. And, what we're seeing out there across, the whole spectrum is that we need more energy out there. And it's just not one of these things where people think, oh, gee, we're in an age where you need less. If you think of the number of devices that are connected today, it's getting more, not less. And so we need more power. And so when we looked at the Grid Innovation Caucus, we wanted to make sure that, we're highlighting what needs to be done out there. And Jerry comes from California and is a Democrat. Here, I'm a Republican from the Midwest, from Ohio. But there are a lot of issues that Jerry and I work together on. And this is one that we really believe in is so important to the future. Because, again, we have to make sure that we have reliability out there. And when you think about what's happened in the last several years, with our cyber attacks that have occurred, you think about last year with the Colonial Pipeline and, the dangers that poses out there. We have to make sure on the cyber side that we're doing everything we possibly can. In my district alone, I've had 7 different events with the FBI so that companies and individuals know how to better protect themselves. But we also want to make sure that, as I've gone across and talked with all of our power generators and power providers here in Ohio and in the country, what is it that they need? And some of the things that, when I'm out, it's absolutely amazing to go to, let's say, a small electric co-op in Northwest Ohio. And one of the things that they're really concentrating on today is on their cyber side. So it's just not on this. When you think about cyber some people think on a larger scale, it's everywhere. And the other areas that, everyone's really concentrating on is making sure that there's reliability out there on the grid, and to see the upgrades that have occurred in the last decade. And that's one of the great things about being on the Energy and Commerce Committee, because when you sit up on the dais, we're looking out over the horizon 5 to 10 years with the innovators and the entrepreneurs and the companies and everyone who's going to be providing services out there, that what they've been able to do. So when Jerry and I looked at on what we could do about the grid, one of the things we even did, we held for our members on the Energy and Commerce Committee to really showcase what's happening in their district at the Rayburn building, which is our office building, and we had a huge event that day, so people on the Hill could come up and see what's happening. But again, when you think about, as I said, what's on the grid and what the legislation that we introduced, and mine was on the cyber sense. And again, you want to make sure that you have the technology out there for companies that they can be secure in. When they put it in, that they don't have to worry about that there could be some kind of a bug in it, you might say, that could have real cyber security issues. And, it kind of takes us back to the Huawei issue that we had a couple of years ago, where we have to do a rip and replace on the communications side. And we don't want to have that happen when you're thinking about on the grid. So when we're thinking about on the cyber side, for testing, for making sure that it's secure, that there's a good partnership out there from the public-private side, and that, this is all voluntary, that we want to make sure it happens. On the grid side, that we also worked on, because again, we have to have a modernization out there. We can't have a system that's 30, 40, 50 years old that's not going to be keeping up, because we know that we're going to be needing more energy, not less. And as more and more people out there think about maybe going to an electric vehicle, we're going to have everything in place for that. So from cyber side to making sure we have the grid upgraded, and again, having a good public-private partnership, that's what we want to see occur in the future.
Excellent. So our nation's legacy transmission grid was largely designed to harness power generated at large generating facilities powered by coal, natural gas, and nuclear, and to deliver that power over shorter distances to population centers where the electricity powers the local economy. Today, we are asking that the transmission grid to move renewable power across and between large geographic regions, such as harnessing Midwestern wind power to electrify East Coast cities. What could Congress do to facilitate this transition? And are there specific legislative proposals that would support the transmission grid of the future?
Well, just going back to 2008, the House Republicans came up with an idea that we really advocate that having an all-above energy strategy. So when you're thinking about your alternatives and nuclear and clean coal and hydro and natural gas, we want to make sure it's out there. And so when you're looking at what's happening out there today, especially with the alternatives and the number of new facilities that are being put up, you have to ask quite a few questions out there. Is the best idea of running these large transmission lines across the country? Is that going to be the most cost-effective and best and most efficient way to do it? What we have to make sure we know what the true costs are as we go into these projects, because again, who's going to end up with the cost? What's going to be the consumer? It's going to be the small companies out there that want to make sure that they stay in business. And it's just yesterday I was in a meeting, and one of the things that came up was, well, how come we're getting such so many companies, especially in Ohio and across the United States? And it's because companies out there are looking at a couple of things. One, that they have a reliable power source, and the other is that what's the cost? And so you have to be able to compete. And this is a world market, and so every penny counts. So we want to make sure that as things are developed, that we do look at what the costs are across the board, and then we also want to make sure that we know exactly that that the ratepayer out there knows what's going to happen. And when you're talking about clean and reliable energy out there, one of the things that sometimes people forget about is that nuclear, if you want to zero-based carbon emissions, that's nuclear. And I've been working on different areas on the nuclear side, especially advanced nuclear, to make sure that we advance it and get it out there. Because again, it's an area that we can really achieve great things here in the United States. I know just recently in my office in Washington, talking about very small nuclear type of technologies that are there, that you could have a very small type of generation that could take care of a company or a small area, like maybe or an industrial park. So we have all these different technologies out there, and so we want to make sure that we can use them.
Thank you. And you mentioned that some of these obstacles that people are running into, and I think one of the most significant obstacles to new transmission development is the siting process for new lines. While states hold primacy with respect to siting of such lines within their borders, the federal government must also play a role when proposed new lines cross federally regulated lands or waters, which they often do. In addition, not in my backyard or NIMBY concerns motivate ordinary citizens to oppose transmission infrastructure. This has resulted in transmission siting timeframes in excess of 7 years. What do you think can and should be done to reduce these excessive timeframes? And how do you think best the federal and state regulators can cooperate to get needed new transmission infrastructure built? Also, do you think the strengthened FERC backstop siting authority in the infrastructure bill could move the needle there?
Well, there's really no silver bullet right off the bat. And I've been very fortunate serving in the Energy and Commerce Committee, especially on the Energy Subcommittee is one of my subcommittees. And we do, when you think about the United States, we're not like a lot of countries. We have a lot of different jurisdictions out there, from the federal, state, even municipalities, county, tribal. And so, you have to be very, very mindful as we go across and develop this. One of the things that, again, what we want to make, I've always advocated for is that you want to make sure that when the regulations, are promulgated, that they're regulations that you can live with. And so I believe that, we have to really watch when we're doing this, because again, you're talking about a lot of different jurisdictions out there. So, it's a tough one. Yeah. And so when we are siting, and it's just like different things on the telecommunication side that we're working on, for instance, is that, we trying to cut some red tape out there and streamline some of the regulations. So you want to make sure that the regulations out there that are out, that the companies and the jurisdictions can all work together with it and not make it too difficult. Because again, that's what you run into sometimes, is that, as you said, they could take years to get something done when things need to be done in a much quicker fashion. So, we want to make sure that we don't have the federal government out there maybe having too much of a sledgehammer, that they're forcing things on localities that they don't really want. And we have to, as I said, be very, very, very mindful of that.
Well, Congressman, we really appreciate your leadership on this issue, and we really thank you for coming to speak to us today. We look forward to working with you, and if anyone has questions, they can direct them to your office. But I think we are really impressed by the Grid Innovation Caucus, and we look forward to seeing what you guys have planned for the future. So thank you so much for your leadership on this.
Well, and again, Ruth, thank you very much for your time this morning. But also, if I could just say that, my door literally is always open. I need to hear from people. I need to hear from companies. I need to hear from everyone as we go forward, because again, I can't do my job unless I hear from folks. And so, it's just like from the last question, as we go forward on things, how can we do things better? And so really it's listening to the people that these and the companies and all that they affect. And so I always appreciate the input. So always have an open door policy. But thank you very much.
Terrific. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Good morning, and it is my great pleasure to welcome Federal Energy Regulatory Commissioner Mark Christie to today's discussion on grid resilience. Commissioner Christie just finished up his first year at FERC and is serving a term that extends halfway through 2025. Immediately before joining FERC, Commissioner Christie was the chairman of the Virginia State Corporation Commission, at which he served for nearly 17 years. As such, he brought back to FERC the very important perspective of a state regulator. During Commissioner Christie's service as a state regulator, he was elected president of the Organization of PJM States and also served as president of the Mid-Atlantic Conference of Regulatory Utility Commissioners. Commissioner is a magna cum laude graduate of Wake Forest University, and he holds a law degree from Georgetown, where he completed a summer clerkship in FERC's General Counsel office, making his career path thereafter all make a lot more sense. Commissioner Christie, welcome to the conversation this morning.
Heath, thank you very much, and thank you to the members of the U.S. Chamber for giving me this honor to speak with you today.
Well, we are really honored to have you here with us this morning, so really appreciate it. Diving into the questions, Commissioner Christie, your prior experience as a state regulatory commissioner provides you with a unique perspective that is highly relevant to the development of new electric transmission infrastructure. On the one hand, FERC has launched a dialogue with state commissioners in its FERC-NARUC Task Force on Transmission. On the other hand, the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act hands FERC expanded authority to cite transmission infrastructure over related state objections. Where do you think the balance should rest between state and federal transmission citing authority?
Mm-hmm. Well, thanks, Heath. And that's an easy one. I absolutely believe that it should be state regulators who should be in charge of approving transmission lines, period, both as to need and as to route. And those are the two things you do as a state regulator when you consider an application to build a transmission line. First question you ask is it needed? And that involves also looking at cost. And then, of course, the second element is the route. Where's it going to go? And I think state regulators are uniquely suited to be the ones who should be making these decisions. They're by far the best prepared. They know their states. They know the challenges of each state. And so it absolutely should be state regulators making these decisions as to which power lines get built and where they go.
Yeah, and of course, that's how most of the power lines we have today have come into existence. It's through that cooperative federalism and sort of the federal oversight a little bit, but then the states actually making the tough calls on siting. FERC, as you well know, has opened an inquiry regarding potential reforms to its transmission planning and cost allocation processes. Much of the Commission's inquiry focuses on the concept of expanding the grid to accommodate future but not yet materialized renewable generation needs. What are your thoughts on this type of anticipatory transmission planning, and how does such planning protect customers from the costs associated with facilities that may ultimately not be needed?
Well, the way I approach transmission is the same way I approach rates, and that is the job of FERC is to ensure a reliable supply of power at the least cost. And when I say least cost, I mean least cost according to the laws that are applicable to the case. And same thing applies to transmission. If transmission is needed, if a transmission line is needed, then it should be built. But need ought to be based on hard data about threats to reliability or congestion costs. It shouldn't be based on speculation about what might benefit a certain group of developers in 10 years or 20 years. And so it's a very expensive item, and it should be built to transmission. My key principle is this: transmission should be built to serve consumers, not some preferred category of developers. And consumers, of course, includes manufacturers. And, manufacturing in America is very power intensive. And so the costs of manufacturing are absolutely key to our economic health, key to whether jobs stay in America or get offshored. Manufacturing needs a lot of power. Business needs a lot of power. So when I talk about protecting consumers from excessive costs of electricity, it's not just residential consumers, it's also business consumers like a lot of your members, because they're the ones paying the bills, and it's essential to our economic health that we keep those bills as low as we can. So transmission planning ought to be about one thing: delivering reliable power at the least cost.
Spoken like a true former state regulator, and definitely, obviously, a welcome view coming from the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. At the end of the day, customers are on the line for the costs here, and it is important to have people in positions such as yours to ensure that costs are continuously considered in decision making at the FERC.
Right. And can I mention something, Heath, as a follow up to that? Let me dispel a narrative that's been pushed by some groups that are trying to push the idea that we ought to be spending another $3 trillion on transmission or some huge amount like that. As I said, if transmission is needed, we ought to build it. No question about it. I mean, that's essential to our economic and our health. But the narrative being pushed that America is not investing in transmission, we haven't put any money into transmission, the transmission grid is falling down, it's creaky, is just not borne out by the facts. Let me give you one fact of data. What's called transmission rate base in the United States has more than doubled over the past decade. Now rate base, without going into the minutia of rate making, rate base is the valuation of assets that gets capitalized, and rates are determined based on what's called rate base. So if the valuation of transmission assets in America has more than doubled over the last decade, that means that rates are following suit. The rates, the element of rates that are being paid by business and residential consumers are going to go up with the rate base going up. I'm not saying that this was not a justified increase in rate base, but the point I'm making is let's use facts and not a false narrative that America is not investing in transmission and the grid's falling down. There's a lot we need to do to harden the grid, and we can talk about that later. But I want to just make it absolutely clear that the data shows that America is not neglecting investment in the grid. A lot of money is going in the grid, and that, of course, is driving rates.
No, that is definitely true. And in a past life, I actually worked for a transmission company, and we definitely did become somewhat offended when people said that that we had an 18th century grid or something along those lines. It's definitely not.
It's not true. It's just a false image being promoted.
Yeah, switching gears a little bit here, Commissioner. It's in a somewhat rare development for FERC watchers, such as myself. You are now merely only the second most recent state public utility commissioner to enjoy the FERC. At the same time, renewable energy advocates are urging FERC to play an elevated role in the expansion of clean energy and its delivery to customers, while environmental activists are urging FERC to play a role in limiting the development of new natural gas infrastructure. Do you believe that your and Commissioner Phillips' backgrounds in the real world, if you will, provides a good foundation for FERC to truly make the best decisions for a resilient and reliable energy system without bending to the pressure on either extreme of an issue?
Well, I'm glad to have Commissioner Phillips join me here. A great appointment by the president. He was a DC commissioner and a great guy, and I've known him even before he got appointed here. So I welcome Willie Phillips to join me on FERC. As a state commissioner, as I was for 17 years, you're very sensitive to cost, because the state commissioners are the ones who have to approve the retail rates, and the retail rates is what actually shows up in customers' bills. Again, not only residential consumers, but also business consumers. Now, moving on to the question of reliability, I said to you earlier, I think that FERC has one primary goal, and that is reliable power at the least cost to consumers. Now, let's talk about reliability. We have to have gas. Gas is essential to keep the lights on. It's not just me saying this, but the experts who know how the grid operates are saying this. The NERC folks, who are truly the experts, they're the reliability experts, have said repeatedly that as we introduce more renewables into the grid, we're going to need gas to balance the grid and keeps the lights on. And let's just talk for a second about how the grid works, and you'll understand that. You don't need to be a rocket scientist or an electrical engineer to understand this. The grid has to be balanced continuously. It has to be balanced every second of every hour of every day. If there's not sufficient electricity being fed into the grid every second to meet the demand of that second, then the lights go out. It's that simple. And when the wind isn't blowing, when the sun is not shining, some other source has to feed electricity into the grid every second of every day. And gas is called balancing. It's called balancing the grid. And gas is the balancing fuel of choice. NERC has said that. Engineers have said that. And the idea that we're going to do away with gas and go to 100% intermittent resources is just simply not realistic. And we need to be realistic as we introduce more renewables into the grid, as we increase the percentage of wind and solar going into the grid, which is a good thing. They're carbon free, a good thing. But we have to keep the lights on. No one is going to be satisfied in America. Americans expect their lights to be on 24/7, 365. That's our standard for reliability in America. And to reach that, we are going to have we have to have sufficient what are called dispatchable resources. Dispatchable mean you can call on them anytime, any weather, and we have to have those resources to keep the grid balanced. That's just basically electrical engineering.
No, that is definitely the case, Commissioner, and it is good to have realism injected into the conversation that oftentimes can be divorced from that. You know,
And we have to be. I'm glad you mentioned that, Heath. As we go through a changing grid, a changing generation mix, which clearly we are, we have to be realistic. We can't keep the lights on with rhetoric. We cannot keep the lights on with sound bites. We can only keep the lights on with electrical power being fed into the grid every second of every day. And we need to be realistic as we go through this.
no, that's true. You know, one last question I have is, you know, there's a lot of, you know, physical and virtual threats to the grid right now. You know, severe weather, ransomware, cyber intrusions, et cetera. And, you know, state regulators have to be, as we said earlier, you know, very mindful of customer cost impacts. You know, in a minute or less, you know, how should FERC work with state regulators to ensure the appropriate level of investment is being made to ensure that reliability and resilience of the transmission grid is maintained?
Well, first of all, FERC, of course, is the parent organization over NERC, the National Electric Reliability Organization, and they set the standards for reliability. State regulators are going to be on the front line, and let me say, and here's why: it's the state regulators who ensure that the grid is being maintained in their territories. And there's things we can do to harden the grid, and we do need to harden the grid against weather. Things like undergrounding when it's appropriate, hardening poles and substations, something as simple as tree trimming. You know, that's a very low tech activity, tree trimming. But tree trimming is very important to keeping the lights on in your neighborhood. And so all of those activities can harden the grid. They have to be paid for. No one can say that the utilities are going to do them for free, because of course they're not. But state regulators are on the front line of determining what of those activities needs to be done to harden the grid. At FERC, of course, our primary responsibility is to make sure that the RTO markets are being run in ways that support reliability, and to make sure that transmission that supports reliability is the standard that's being followed. But it's the state regulators who are looking at things like, are you doing sufficient tree trimming? Can you harden your poles? Can you harden your substations? What are you doing in the state level? And of course, these are all costly, so we need to vet them to make sure that what's being done is absolutely necessary and worth the cost.
Commissioner Christie, it's really been a pleasure having you here this morning. You know, thank you for bringing you know, the state perspective, the customer perspective, and just the reality perspective to the FERC. And you know, we look forward to working with you in years to come.
You bet, Heath, and thank you very much. Really enjoyed it, and thank you for the honor of speaking to you, and glad to do it again.
I'm now pleased to be joined by Tim Holt, who leads the global transmission business for Siemens Energy. Tim's joining us from Orlando, Florida, which is home to the North American headquarters of Siemens Energy. He's been with the company for 26 years in a number of senior roles across their energy portfolio, including gas and power generation services, and wind and renewable services, energy services as well. So we're very fortunate to have his experience joining us today in a conversation about modernizing the electric grid. So Tim, thanks for joining us today. And of course, thanks to Siemens Energy for sponsoring our EnergyInnovates series.
Thanks for having me.
Well, Tim, let's dive right in. Siemens Energy is active in almost every segment of the energy value chain. You refer to it as a pure play energy company. So how does that perspective shape the way you look at resilience of the energy grid?
So when we look at resilience across the entire energy value chain, for us, it's really looking at not just transmission, but also generation. And Siemens Energy is active in all these areas. We have products and solutions there. And we also are majority owner of the Siemens Gamesa wind business, so we understand the role of renewables. So And all these pieces in the value chain on the generation and transmission side are interdependent and all must be resilient. And without resiliency, there is no reliability. And without reliability, the economy and the society do not function. And I think that's the important piece we keep in mind, and that's what we strive for. You know, we have more than 10,000 US employees that deliver these products and solutions, and that really keep the lights on. And we have seen that during COVID, how important that was when, you know, the majority of the country shut down. So sustainability is also on the top of our mind, and it's really also about protecting our planet as the number one priority. So we take that holistic view on resiliency, and I'm really excited to talk about this today.
Great. Well, as we know, throughout our program today, we're going to discuss the various challenges and the opportunities for grid modernization. And you know, as we all know, the grid infrastructure in the United States is decades old in some instances. So how big of a challenge does this aging infrastructure pose to ensuring the resiliency and safety of the grid?
You know, talking to our customers and clients, quite a challenge, and it's all about modernizing and upgrading the aging infrastructure to really increase that reliability and safety that I talked about. And you know, the existing grid has experienced different ways of investment. Some regions are in different stages in that modernization than others. And to prepare the grid for the future, it's really important we look at replacements, we look at retrofits and refurbishment and new investments. All of them are necessary. And we work with our customers in several ways to address this aging infrastructure. And we have a resilience concept that's called PRETACT. It's about 3 pillars that are preventing, protecting, and reacting. And as you know, drastic failures lead to long shutdown times, and this affects really our customers, particularly those who depend on uninterrupted energy supply. You know, certain industries, you can't really afford that. And our technology can help prevent that. And just a couple examples to name here, as simple as explosion and fire safe solutions for substations. We look at substituting mineral oil as an insulation with biodegradable fluid in the transformers, reducing the fire risk. But it's also using what we call phase shift transformers and variable shunt reactors that optimize the transmission and the grid performance. And I think one good example is the Transpac cable in San Francisco, where we have 300 megawatt of black start capability that can power really that critical infrastructure, hospitals, fire stations, emergency centers during an outage. And I think that's really the big part about how do we address this in the aging infrastructure. There's quite a bit of investment required, but we do it in a manner that, you know, can do it in phases without overwhelming the system. And that's what we look forward to make happen.
Great. Well, clearly there's a lot of innovation going on in this part of the industry. But let's get a little more granular. You know, the transition to more decarbonized energy systems is well underway. How many people, when they think about decarbonization, they think about more generation of power with renewables. And I do want to get to the renewables question in a moment. But I want to hear your thoughts on the opportunities to reduce the emissions intensity of the transmission grid itself. And what that means for resiliency. Is that something that Siemens Energy is discussing and, you know, with your customers?
Definitely. I mean, as you can imagine, you know, with our portfolio in Siemens Energy, a lot of focus is on the generation side, shifting from fossil fuels to renewables. But there's also quite a bit of discussion on the transmission side. And as you might know, the most used insulation gas in high voltage power grids is something that is called SF6, which is sulfur hexafluoride, and it's extremely harmful to the environment. It's the most potent greenhouse gas, and most people don't know it. It's 25,000 times has a higher global warming potential than CO2, and it stays in the atmosphere for over 3,200 years. So you can see the impact that it has. So we want to fix this, and we want to eliminate the need in our product or in the products that are used in the industry for this harmful greenhouse gas. And we invested now for quite some time a significant amount of R&D money in our high voltage switchgear systems and our blue portfolio that uses only clean air for insulation. So 0 global warming potential and 0 toxic byproducts. It's comparable in performance to SF6, even better in some technical areas, same level of reliability and resiliency, and it reduces emissions. And you can ask yourself, I mean, great, if it has all these properties, why isn't it been used? Of course, right now, the equipment is not as compact as the existing equipment that uses SF6, still a bit more expensive. And the way the transmission system operators and distribution system operators are reimbursed, that there's no really a incentive to go and switch out all the old equipment that has SF6. And I think this is something that we have been discussing also with customers, with regulators. I think everybody sees the benefits. The industry normally takes a view where they want to test it, get comfortable with the solution. But I think we're on a very good pathway in pushing this really environmentally friendly solution into the transmission system. And I hope we can really grow this portfolio going forward.
Great. Well, Tim, that sounds like a fascinating opportunity, and I'm willing to guess that it's something that not a whole lot of people are aware of. So I appreciate you really diving into that a little further. So let's turn to the renewables question. No question, the share of renewables in the power generation market, is growing. It's going to continue to grow. But from your perspective, how should the variability in generation powered by renewables, be addressed to increase resiliency and reliability?
Yeah, that's a good question. And as you probably aware of, a lot of discussion is how do we grow the share of renewables? How do we install more wind turbines, more solar PV wind parks, solar farms? I think the part that didn't have as much focus in the past was really then how do we integrate all this additional renewable power into the system? And that's where we have seen quite a bit of activity. Started in Europe, with the connection of the offshore wind farms to onshore. But we also have seen now some recent wins in the US. We have Siemens Energy. We won the Sunrise Wind, New York's first utility scale offshore wind farm, the transmission system we won. Also on Dominion, the Virginia Coastal Offshore Wind Center, we won that connection. So you see also that activity is picking up in the US. And it's going to be also one of the major drivers in the industry also, how do we connect all this renewable power? And as you can imagine, offshore wind, you need to bring the power to shore, where we see most of the wind generation in the Midwest. How do you bring that to the load centers on the East Coast? And I think there's a couple of technologies that are picking up speed. Also here in the US, HVDC is a good choice to transport power over long distances, highest efficiency, lowest operational cost. And I think this is also an area where we see quite a bit of activity picking up to make sure we not only install the green power, the renewable power, but also bring it to the load centers. I think the other part that we have to look at, similar, you talked or you hinted at it a bit, is the intermittency of renewable power. And the grid doesn't like it. And for a long time we had base load power, steam turbine power plants, gas power plants, which run base load, very little fluctuation. But also here we need to enhance the grid infrastructure, making sure we protect it against this higher volatility, the frequency fluctuations. That's also where we see quite a bit of technology being deployed, something that we call FACTS, flexible AC transmission, set of products that is implemented at these critical transmission nodes to upgrade, the system and provide the necessary power flow control stability and increase the efficiency. So that's also where we see quite a bit of activity that's kind of at the back end of all the installation of the wind and solar power that we have seen.
Okay, so let's bring Mother Nature into the conversation for a moment. In 2021, we experienced several natural disasters that impacted the power grid. We saw the severe storms that ripped through the Midwest more recently, and of course, Texas was impacted by Winter Storm Uri nearly a year ago. Now, understanding there were many dynamics at play in Texas, what do you see as the steps that can and must be taken to ensure a resilient grid?
Yeah, I think first of all, I think we have to say, steps can be taken to avoid a repeat of what happened in Texas last year. And also we testified in front of the Texas House and Senate to share some best practices last year. Some of our competitors did as well. And we felt this wasn't just enough to give a statement what could have done. But we want to play an active role. So we took it a step further, and we had our experts on it, and to write a white paper to develop really a set of recommendations. How do we increase resiliency? And I'm actually glad to announce we're releasing that report today, and it includes 15 ways to upgrade the Texas infrastructure to make it more resilient. It includes monitoring, weatherizing assets, enhancing, the existing gas power generation, expanding gas storage, and prioritizing gas delivery infrastructure. So it's really important for us. It's close to our heart. We got over 1,500 Siemens Energy employees working in Texas. We're really committed to work with our customers and the regulators to improve the system and see that we got a resilient system going forward.
Well, Tim, that's really exciting, and I'd like to love hearing about the report, and we're certainly happy to make that report available to the people who are watching here today. So thanks for letting us know about that. So Tim, this has been a great discussion, and to close out, what I want to talk, let's talk about what's next. Now that the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act is actually being implemented, what are the opportunities that you see from the law's significant investments in modernizing the nation's grid?
So, I'm glad to see that we in the United States have really, set some ambitious decarbonization goals. And, I think just read a recent study from researchers at Princeton's, what does it take to achieve these net zero emissions? And, the United States will need to expand its electricity transmission system by 60% by 2030 and may need to triple it by 2050. So keep in mind, the current power grid took 150 years to build. And now we need to build that same amount of transmission again in the next 15 years, and then build that again, or much more of that, and then in the 15 years thereafter. So, quite a big challenge. But there's also the bipartisan acknowledgement of these needs in the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, and the billions of dollars that are designated for the grid modernization. And I have to say, we at Siemens Energy really applaud Democrats and Republicans for championing the issue and these historic investments. And, the type of investments and the other incentives that are currently under debate will enable the energy transition and really move the U.S. closer to its resiliency and decarbonization goals. And, in order to make that energy transition successful, we need a reliable grid, and that's really critical. And we really look forward to work with our customers, the Department of Energy, the regulators, and policymakers in really implementing the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act and creating that environment that makes the United States the energy, technology, and transition leader.
Well, Tim, we couldn't agree with you more about the benefits of the bipartisan infrastructure bill, and we're very pleased to be, play a role in getting that across the finish line. You've given us a lot to think about today, and really added a lot to our conversation about the innovation that's going on in this sector, and concrete steps that we know can be taken, to meet our decarbonization goals and just to simply grow our economy and get the energy to where it's needed. So thank you again for joining us, and thanks again to Siemens Energy for your sponsorship of EnergyInnovates.
Thanks for having me again.
Thank you, Marty, for that great interview with Tim Holt from Siemens Energy. Really appreciated it. I am now joined by three experts in grid resilience and in the grid in general. The first of that is Scott Aronson, who is Vice President of Security and Preparedness at Edison Electric Institute. We also have Richie O'Neill, who's the Executive Director of the GridWise Alliance, and Barbara Tyran, who's the Director of the Macro Grid Initiative at the American Council on Renewable Energy. Welcome to all of you, and thank you for joining us this morning. Each of your organizations recognizes that the power grid of 10 or 20 years from now will necessarily look very different from what we have today. However, there are different visions for how we get there and what tools and policies drive the enhancement and expansion of the power grid most effectively and efficiently to meet our future energy needs. Barbara, starting out with you, how does ACOR's Macro Grid Initiative propose that we develop the grid of the future?
Well, thank you, Heath. It's a pleasure to be here. And I would like to amplify the remarks of the prior speaker, which is that we do have a changing generation mix. But to further go on with his point about that change, there are actually 88% of United States wind energy potential and 56% of our solar potential in the 15 states between the Rocky Mountains and Mississippi River. But in that area, across those 15 states, it is now projected that only 30% of the demand, the energy demand in 2050 will be in those 15 states. So that means we have an abundance of domestic energy resources that are available that could be used in the load centers on the coast. And so one of the things that we're proud of at the Macro Grid Initiative is that we have 30 organizations, and I mean diverse organizations, who have signed on to the Macro Grid Initiative vision statement, which very simply reads that we need an expanded, enhanced transmission delivery system that will enable us to have more jobs and economic development, reduce the cost of electricity to consumers, and provide a cleaner environment. And if anyone is interested in that information or the reports that substantiate that, please feel free to go to the Macro Grid Initiative website for more information. Thank you.
Thanks a lot for that, Barbara. Really appreciate it. Scott, how are EEI and its members advancing the grid of the future?
Hey, thanks for that, Heath, and it's good to see everybody. Appreciate the opportunity to speak to y'all. I guess I would say one word, and that word is platform. I'll expand on that just a little bit. The idea here is that the electric companies of the United States provide reliable, affordable, clean energy. And as large owners operators who operate that transmission grid that Barbara was talking about and that Tim from Siemens was talking about just before, the idea here is to have a platform that can enable the affordable, clean, reliable, resilient energy grid that we all rely on. We do that through some efficiencies that you get from economies of scale. We do that from more than $120 billion year over year in capital expenses. We do that in our ability to decarbonize the economy by electrifying by electrifying other segments of the sector, for example, or other segments of the economy, for example, automobiles. And looking at things like ports and air and fleets and airports and on and on and on. So scale, capital expenses, decarbonization, building this platform that enables the grid of the future, whether it is all of the renewables that are in those 15 states that are right in the center of the country, or providing that platform that enables more distributed resources in communities across the country.
Yeah, Scott, it is definitely an exciting time in the electric industry and a time of great growth into new sectors of the economy. Last but not least, Richie, can you tell us how the GridWise Alliance envisions the pathway from today's power grid to the modernized grid of 2035 and beyond?
Yeah, thank you. And I really just want to echo Barbara and Scott, both of your points there. I love being called an expert in grid resilience, that's a first, but we do work with them. And I think it's important to just note that the point on being a platform and an enabler, I think there's some specific examples of that are happening. And Scott will even point out one that we just heard about from EEI, which is the National Electric Highway Coalition. And I think just from a standpoint of what they're doing, looking at coordinating efforts across regions, but even nationally now, around EV charging on major corridors and how utilities can work together. And that kind of collaboration is enabling a lot of these changes to happen really fast. So I think when I think pathway and when we talk about it, in our groups, we're thinking, how can we enable that path to happen quicker? The changes are happening. We've heard a lot about them on the transmission side here, but they're happening really fast on the distribution side too. And so how can we enable states to be able to, in local areas, to be able to accept these investments that are coming and really upgrade their grid quickly? So when we're thinking pathway, we're also thinking kind of at a micro level too.
Thanks a lot, Richie. I think we can all agree that the continuing decarbonization of our energy system is the primary driver of grid transformation today. The increase of offshore, rurally sited, and distributed renewable generation resources and the retirement of older central station type power plants are moving the sources of our electricity both farther from and at the same time much closer to consumers. While the addition of new infrastructure contributes to making the power grid more robust, it also introduces additional points of failure or compromise by our adversaries, particularly in cyberspace. Scott, starting with you, how are your utility members advancing grid modernization and expansion while defending against security concerns that were not as relevant when today's network was initially built?
Yeah, you hit the paradox exactly right. On the one hand, we've got this we've got great visibility. We've got all of this sort of insight into the energy grid across the country, but we are also expanding the attack surface. And there's all sorts of examples through history of where we have built secure or what need to be secure infrastructures on top of inherently insecure infrastructure. An example would be the internet. Never meant to have all of this critical infrastructure layered on top of it. By design, it was supposed to be free and open and able to share things really easily. It's really good at sharing things easily, but it's also really good, unfortunately, at creating potential vulnerabilities. And so as we think about critical infrastructure, I want to say a couple of things. One is critical infrastructure isn't just a fun label that we like to put on the sector. We are critical to the life, health, and safety of the communities we serve. We are critical to national security. And so therefore, we need to think about how to make sure that the grid of the future is inherently secure. That means baking security in, not bolting it on after the fact. That means that consumer grade devices, while giving customers control is important, should not be used in critical applications. And it means working together with other sectors. It means working together with the government to prioritize. It doesn't mean saying that everything in the energy grid has to be locked down and completely secure. We want customers to have control. We want distributed resources. We want the inherent resiliency that all of that brings to the equation. But at the same time, as we are looking at truly must-run systems, as we're looking at that foundation of the grid, we need to make sure that we are, again, baking security in, not bolting it on, benefiting from the better visibility we get, but also understanding that we have expanded the attack surface.
Thanks a lot, Scott. Richie, from your perspective, how can grid enhancement, at distribution level or otherwise, best be accomplished while ensuring reliability and resilience?
Yeah, and we're going to be in alignment a lot here, I guess, but I think just to echo that is the primary concern is reliability and resilience as all of these enhancements or changes or growth is happening wherever that is happening. And there's so many new stakeholders when we talk about customers and there's so many new ways that the grid is going to work. So I think focusing on one area, let's say the grid edge, it's really important that we support DOE and our agencies and all the way down to state and local agencies as well on getting really detailed on what are the real benefits of the grid, either transmission or distribution. How can it work to solve their outcomes? And so I think being able to talk about what are the solutions that either states or cities are looking to find, what are their challenges, and then finding the right kinds of solutions. So at GridWise, we've got a technology portfolio where we're talking about not just the technologies specifically, we're technology agnostic in what could work, but talking about outcomes of what are you trying to do, and here are the kinds of technologies. There's overlapping kind of benefits to a lot of these things. So making sure that we are really explaining the full benefits from a holistic view is important. And, I think that really the word that I hear a lot is just affordability. This can't be a burden to ratepayers. So I think, we keep saying it, and I know, Scott, you said it a couple of times already, but this affordability factor, as we do all this, it has to be front, it can't be the fourth or fifth thing that we're focused on.
Thanks a lot, Richie. And Barbara, what are ACOR's views on ensuring the security and resilience of a next generation power grid?
Sure. Thanks, Heath. Well, certainly I would agree with what Scott and Richie have been talking about here. We do need a stronger grid in light of some of the challenges we face today. And there are benefits that can be derived from that literally on a daily basis. So in addition to diversified energy supplies, which goes back to what Congressman Latta was talking about earlier in the program, reduced costs, and as Richie said, increased reliability and resilience. Those are the goals that we're all striving for. We also have more examples of extreme weather these days, and certainly the Texas winter storm Uri has gotten a lot of attention around that. What's gotten less attention, actually, is the fact that in the West this past summer, there were very intense heat waves. But thanks to the interregional transmission connections between the Pacific Northwest and California, and the fact that the intense weather fluctuated north and south, they were able to support each other through that weather episode so that the lights stayed on, and importantly, the air conditioning stayed on during that experience. Looking at this from a national security standpoint, ACOR and SAFE actually convened a roundtable on national security and transmission on December 9th with former military leaders and DoD senior officials. And we were very pleased to have their participation. Resulting from that, 6 of those leaders signed on to the ANOPR reply comments that were submitted by SAFE. In those reply comments, and I quote, they call for a transmission reforms and expansion in the form of a national macro grid. So that is the national security community, or one facet of it, speaking out on that topic. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Barbara. And, given time, I think this next one will probably be our last question. So make sure to get everything out you want to get out now. But, as Siemens Energy's Tim Holt just mentioned in the prior segment, current projections forecast the need for about a 60% expansion of our transmission grid by 2030, and then an overall tripling of our transmission infrastructure by 2050. While the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, makes some headway in funding and signing new transmission facilities, and the Department of Energy's Building a Better Grid initiative, this announced last week, shines additional light on the issue, neither is likely to provide the full momentum needed for the dramatic expansion of the grid. Richie, starting with you, what additional federal laws or policies, either from Congress or from FERC, are necessary to support a threefold expansion of our power grid by 2050?
I'll do rapid. So we're a minute here, so I'll be quick. I just think if we talked about this a year ago, we would be talking kind of at a very federal level of what we need to do to get some of this investment kind of through the door. Talking about it now, it's very apparent that the funding is going to go to states. So I don't know if it's additional federal or kind of fake or FERC rules. I think we're more focused on how can we help states get the funding they need efficiently. What are the agencies? What are the vehicles? What are the things that are already in place? How can we support DOE and DOT and other agencies to make sure that this comes out efficiently? I know it's not a stimulus, but how can we make sure that this funding goes to the right places as quickly as possible? And so that's kind of our focus right now.
Thanks a lot, Richie. And just for our audience, we are going to run a couple minutes over, but we should wrap up by about 11:05. Barbara, what do you view as the needed federal drivers for grid expansion?
Well, I think we're at a very fortunate time for those of us in the transmission world. We do have a FERC rulemaking underway, and they have issued an advance notice of proposed rulemaking that looks at generator interconnection, cost allocation, and transmission planning. I'm very pleased that over 24 organizations signed the Macrogrid Initiative's joint statement FERC on that ANOPR, and we were very pleased to have their participation in that joint statement. We not only commended FERC for undertaking that rulemaking, but also commended FERC for launching the federal state joint task force on transmission. And that is essentially the FERC commissioners working with 10 NARUC state public utility commissioners to try to come to an agreement around some of these issues. I think it's extremely important that we have federal and state collaboration to help resolve some of the important issues that are coming up regarding transmission today.
You know, Barbara, I couldn't agree with you more on that point and the importance of sort of continued state and federal dialogue. And wrapping it up, Scott, you know, with the IOUs, you know, what policies are you and your members looking for to support their expansion of our electricity network?
Thanks, Heath. Yeah, in the interest of time, and a lot of good alignment on this panel. Agree, federal and state is going to be, each has a role, and I think getting money out thoughtfully is going to be a joint effort between owners and operators and federal and state jurisdictions. I will say, on a regulatory front, not to get too kind of pedantic or in the weeds, but I think we're looking at this idea of a risk-based approach to all of this resilience investment, making sure that we are understanding the difference between resilience and reliability. I think we always hear reliability. That is the North American Electric Reliability Corporation, right? That is what we are regulated to. That's operation in normal conditions. It's a little bit different when you're trying to do resilience, which is operation in abnormal conditions, and helping people, regulators in particular, understand the value of those resilience investments and how those ultimately can help customers and ultimately help with better outcomes for a more resilient infrastructure, which is what we need in the face of cyber and physical attacks, which is what we need in the face of more severe weather all across the country, really building out a more thoughtful regulatory model for the future of the grid.
Scott, thanks so much. Also, Richie, Barbara, thank you all for joining us today. Really appreciate this conversation. And I'm going to pass it back to Marty Durbin to close us out.
Thank you again for joining today's session of Energy Innovates, and thanks to the outstanding lineup of speakers that we had for today's event. Please be on the lookout for future Energy Innovates events in the coming months. And again, let me thank our sponsor, Siemens Energy. No worries, I had read over it several times.